Why did no one ever see her for who she really was? That thought flickered in Alina Rodriguez's mind as she crossed the cracked asphalt of Fort Meridian's parking lot, a styrofoam cup of black coffee in one hand and her ID badge clutched in the other. The North Carolina sun was already heavy, hanging over the base like a weighted blanket, pressing sweat into the collar of her pressed blouse. Soldiers streamed past her in crisp uniforms, boots clicking with the cadence of confidence. She kept her pace quiet, her gaze lowered, as if invisibility were part of her job description. For 8 months she had walked this same stretch, past the manicured lawns, past the flagpole snapping in the humid breeze, past the memorial plaque that listed names she tried not to read. The young MP at the gate barely glanced up from his newspaper before waving her through. To him, she was just another civilian staffer, cafeteria worker, office aide, one of hundreds who kept the gears of the base turning. He couldn't have known that she once carried men twice his weight off Afghan ridgelines, blood soaking her uniform, adrenaline making her body move when logic said it should collapse. To him, she was just a woman with a badge. Inside Building 47, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Officers hurried down polished linoleum corridors with folders tucked under their arms, their voices clipped, their boots echoing against the walls. Alina slipped against the current, toward the tucked-away office where food service logistics were managed. Rosa Martinez was already at her desk, color-coded charts spread neatly in front of her like a battlefield map. "You're cutting it close," Rosa said, glancing up with the tired but warm eyes of a woman who juggled too much and still carried herself with competence. "Traffic near Pine Ridge," Alina answered, dropping into her chair. "An accident at the exit." Rosa nodded, not pressing further. She rarely did. Their friendship was built on small talk, coffee breaks, complaints about schedules, weekend plans, safe ground. Rosa never asked about the quiet shadows behind Alina's eyes, and Alina never offered. Hours passed in the rhythm of numbers and menus. Purchase orders, inventory counts, dietary requests from officers who wanted low-sodium meals or gluten-free rolls. It was unremarkable work, safe work. And yet, in a strange way, it was harder than combat had ever been. Combat had demanded everything in the moment, absolute focus, absolute urgency. This demanded she bury what she was. At 10:30, Captain Derek Morrison appeared in the doorway, his uniform pressed so sharply it looked starched into place. His presence carried the easy arrogance of a man who had never wondered whether his voice mattered. "Ladies," he said, his tone carrying more ownership than respect, "adjustments for today's lunch. General Blackwood and General Stone will arrive early, 11:45. Rosa straightened. "We'll be ready, sir." And Morrison continued, stepping into the cramped office, "We'll need more serving staff. This isn't just any lunch. These are 3-star generals. Everything must be flawless." His eyes landed on Alina like she was furniture, something to be assigned, moved, used. "What about her?" he said, gesturing without bothering to recall her name. Rosa shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Alina handles administration. She's not trained for service." "How hard can it be?" Morrison's smirk cut like paper. "Carry plates, refill glasses, smile." Alina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't argue. Arguing only made men like Morrison press harder. "I'll help," she said simply, her voice steady, professional. "Good," Morrison replied, satisfied as if he'd solved a crisis. "Be in uniform by 11:30, and try to look appropriate." He left without another word. Rosa leaned closer once he was gone. "You don't have to do this. I can call someone else." "It's fine," Alina said, and in some ways it was. She had carried heavier burdens than trays of salmon and salad. She had served food before, not on porcelain plates beneath chandeliers, but in foil packets, kneeling in sand and dust, pressing MREs into the hands of starving, wounded men. Morrison could never have imagined that. At 11:15 she changed into the serving uniform, black slacks, white blouse. In the mirror, she adjusted her hair, made sure her expression was professional but unremarkable. The reflection staring back at her could have been anyone. Forgettable. That was the point. The dining hall was a cathedral to hierarchy. Dark wood paneling, portraits of commanders, polished silver and crystal under an old chandelier. A table long enough to seat a dozen ambitions. Alina reviewed the serving order with the kitchen staff. Salad at 11:50, entree at 12:15, dessert at 12:45. Simple. But nothing about military gatherings was ever simple. One by one, officers arrived. Majors, lieutenant colonels, names Alina recognized from memos but not from faces. They settled into their seats with the ease of people accustomed to being served. Morrison paced like a man whose career rested on the shine of a fork. His nerves betrayed him more than he realized. Then, at exactly 11:45, the door opened. General Thomas Blackwood entered, compact, silver-haired, eyes sharp as if forged in years of command. His presence was quieter than Morrison, but heavier. It carried the weight of lived consequence. Behind him came General Margaret Stone, every bit as imposing but different, sharp intellect in every stride, the kind of authority forged not by inheritance but by battles against dismissal, prejudice, and silence. The room shifted subtly, chairs straightened, voices softened, deference thickened the air. Alina remained at the serving station, invisible exactly as Morrison had intended. She moved when the time came, placing salad plates before officers engrossed in talk of budgets, readiness, personnel rotations. She was background, a shadow moving between uniforms. But she noticed everything. The way Foster, a young lieutenant, strutted in late with apologies. The way Morrison overcompensated with fake ease. The way Stone's eyes cut through every answer like blades testing armor. Alina moved with precision, unremarkable efficiency. Each plate placed, each glass refilled, each step careful, calculated. She could have done it blindfolded. She had moved like this through combat zones, quiet, deliberate, unseen. Then it happened. As she leaned forward to set a salad in front of General Blackwood, her sleeve shifted, just slightly, enough to catch the light, enough to show a glimpse of what she had kept buried for 18 months. A small silver star. Not decoration, not jewelry, not an accident. It was America's third highest award for valor in combat. And in that split second, the air in the room shifted. Blackwood froze, his eyes narrowing, his instincts catching a detail others missed. To the rest, she was still invisible. To him, she had just become a mystery that demanded unraveling. Alina didn't notice his stare. She was too busy moving to the next seat, setting the next plate, maintaining her rhythm. She thought she was still unseen. But she was, not anymore. General Thomas Blackwood had spent 34 years in uniform, and in that time he had learned one lesson that never failed him. The smallest details often carried the greatest weight. A missing radio battery, a flicker of movement on a ridgeline, the faint sound of boots over gravel. Details separated survival from disaster. So when the quiet server leaned across the table and her sleeve revealed a flash of silver, Blackwood's eyes locked on it with the precision of a rifle scope. He recognized it instantly, though his mind almost rejected the incongruity. A silver star, America's third highest military decoration. It didn't belong on the arm of someone serving salads. He blinked once, steadying his expression, forcing himself not to react outwardly. Around him, conversation rolled on, personnel numbers, budget constraints, readiness metrics. No one else had noticed. Not yet, but he had, and it changed everything. The woman, Alina, though he didn't yet know her name, moved on without a flicker of awareness, her hands steady as she placed another plate. To the others, she was background. To Blackwood, she had just become a question wrapped in a mystery. What was a Silver Star recipient doing in a server's uniform, invisible among men who had never faced half the dangers she must have? General Blackwood. The voice pulled him back. Major Sullivan, waiting for his response to a question he hadn't heard. He forced a smile, deflecting smoothly, offering an answer about training protocols while his mind spun on a different axis. His peripheral vision tracked Alina's every move. The way she moved through the room, economical, fluid, eyes constantly scanning. Not the aimless glances of a civilian. This was something else. A soldier's awareness. Afghanistan, he guessed. Maybe Iraq. 3 deployments, maybe more. He could see it in her eyes. Not fatigue, not bitterness, but the kind of weight only carried by those who had stood in fire and not broken. General Margaret Stone noticed his distraction. Stone, who had built her reputation on catching subtleties others ignored, followed his gaze. Her eyes flicked to Alina and then back to Blackwood, narrowing with curiosity. The salad plates were cleared. Alina returned with the main course, herb-roasted salmon, vegetables perfectly arranged, the kind of meal Morrison hoped would impress visiting generals. She moved silently, but when she approached Blackwood again, he spoke. His voice was low, careful, meant for her ears alone. "That's an interesting pin you're wearing." Her hand faltered just for the briefest moment as she set his plate down. The kind of micro-expression that would pass unnoticed by most, but not by Blackwood. "Thank you, sir," she said evenly, her tone controlled. "Where did you serve?" Her eyes flicked around the table. No one was paying attention. Conversation buzzed on. When she answered, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Afghanistan, sir. 3 deployments." Blackwood's chest tightened. Afghanistan during those years was a crucible. Medals weren't handed out like candy. A silver star there meant something unspeakably difficult had been endured and overcome. "What was your MOS?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then gave the answer. 68 Whiskey, sir, combat medic." It clicked instantly. The alertness, the precision, the steady hands. A medic. One of the Army's most demanding and dangerous roles. Soldiers who ran toward the fire, not away from it. Soldiers who patched torn bodies under fire and dragged comrades across kill zones. Blackwood sat back, his mind racing. Here she was, a decorated combat medic, reduced to serving plates because some captain thought she looked the part. The injustice was almost physical. He asked one more question, equally quiet. "How long since separation?" 18 months, sir." Then she moved away, carrying another plate, leaving him with more questions than answers. Across the table, General Stone was studying the exchange with surgical precision. Her instincts told her something important had just happened. Her gaze sharpened on Alina, reading her posture, her careful invisibility. Stone had fought too hard for women in uniform not to recognize one when she saw her. The meal continued, but the undercurrent had shifted. Blackwood's focus never left her. Stone's eyes followed her movements too, her curiosity sharpening. Morrison, oblivious, prattled about readiness reports and morale statistics, blissfully unaware that the real story in the room was unfolding behind his back. Dessert was served with military efficiency, key lime pie, coffee steaming in porcelain cups. Alina moved as she had all afternoon, but now her awareness was sharper. She could feel Blackwood's eyes on her, Stone's attention weighing her down. For months, she had perfected invisibility. Now it was unraveling. Stone waited until Alina leaned to refill her coffee. Her voice, pitched low but firm, cut through the background noise. "You've been very attentive throughout this meal." Alina froze for half a heartbeat, then forced a polite nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Stone's eyes lingered. Not just polite acknowledgement. She was studying her, assessing her like an officer evaluated a new recruit. "How long have you worked at Fort Meridian?" Stone asked, her tone deceptively casual. 8 months, ma'am." "And before that?" Alina's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Blackwood. She could feel the weight of the question, the trap closing. Her answer was diplomatic. "A different field, ma'am." Stone smiled faintly, recognizing the evasion. That's an interesting way to put it. Blackwood spoke then, his voice deliberate. Alina Rodriguez, isn't it? Every officer at the table turned, surprised that he knew her name. Alina's stomach tightened, but she answered calmly. Yes, sir. And your previous field of employment was military service. The room shifted. Forks paused, conversation stilled. Morrison's eyes widened, confusion written across his face. Yes, sir, Alina said. Her voice was steady, but inside she could feel the ground trembling. Stone leaned forward. What was your rank at separation? Staff Sergeant, ma'am. And your MOS? Alina hesitated just for a moment, but the silence in the room demanded honesty. 68 Whiskey, Combat Medic Specialist. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the quiet of disinterest, but the silence of recognition. A combat medic, a non-commissioned officer, sitting in front of them in a server's uniform. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell cleared his throat. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, forgive my confusion, but how does a combat medic with multiple deployments end up in food service coordination? Alina's jaw tightened. Her answer was polite, diplomatic. The transition from military to civilian employment can be challenging, sir. Sometimes the available positions don't align perfectly with military experience. The truth was heavier, sharper, but she wasn't going to lay it bare for them. Not yet. Morrison finally found his voice, stammering. Staff Sergeant, when I asked you to serve today, you didn't mention. You didn't ask, sir, Alina said evenly. Her tone was respectful, but it carried a quiet edge that cut straight through him. You asked if I could carry plates and refill water glasses, and I could. Stone's lips pressed into something between approval and controlled fury. Approval for Alina's composure. Fury at the institution that had allowed her to be here, unrecognized, unseen. Her next question came sharp, deliberate. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, what decorations did you receive during your service? Alina's throat tightened. She could feel every eye in the room pressing down on her. For 18 months she had buried this part of herself. Now it was being dragged into the open. Multiple campaign ribbons, combat medical badge, Army commendation medals. She paused. The pause stretched until it became unbearable. Then quietly. And the Silver Star, ma'am. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. A Silver Star. Every officer in the room understood what that meant. Gallantry, heroism, valor in the face of the enemy. Something most of them had only ever read about in reports. Captain Morrison's mouth actually fell open. For hours, he had treated her like a waitress. And now he realized he had ordered a Silver Star recipient to carry trays. Alina sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. But inside, her pulse pounded. The anonymity she had constructed so carefully was gone, shattered in an instant. General Stone's eyes were locked on her now, sharp and unrelenting. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, her voice formal, deliberate. What action earned you the Silver Star? Alina felt the memories rising, memories she had kept compartmentalized, locked away behind walls of silence. The forward operating base, the attack, the bodies, the fire. She inhaled once, steadying herself, and when she spoke her voice was detached, clinical, as if reciting someone else's after-action report. Helmand Province. Coordinated attack on our position. Multiple casualties. The medevac bird was disabled on the landing zone. I provided trauma care to 12 wounded soldiers under fire, then organized and led their evacuation to a secondary extraction point. She stopped. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was crushing. Around the table, faces shifted. Respect, shock, shame. Morrison looked pale. Lieutenant Foster looked like her entire worldview had cracked. Mitchell leaned back, his expression heavy with the realization of what she had endured. General Blackwood nodded slowly, confirming what he had suspected. General Stone leaned back too, her eyes blazing with anger not at Alina, but at the system that had buried her here unseen. In that moment, the dining hall was no longer a room of officers eating lunch. It was a courtroom, a reckoning. And Alina Rodriguez, who had spent 18 months making herself invisible, was suddenly the most visible person in the room. The silence that followed Alina's words was not the silence of routine deference. It was the silence of revelation, of a room forced to confront something it hadn't expected to find. The ornate clock on the far wall ticked louder than it ever had. Somewhere outside, a truck rumbled past, but inside the dining hall, every eye was fixed on her. General Stone's voice was the first to cut through, firm, low, and edged with controlled fury. You organized an evacuation under enemy fire while treating 12 casualties. That's what earned you the Silver Star. Yes, ma'am, Alina answered simply. The understatement made the air thicker. The officers around the table understood what wasn't said: the chaos, the blood, the constant threat of death. They understood what it meant for a medic to step into command when everyone else was down. They understood that medals like that weren't given for surviving. They were given for saving others. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, disbelief coloring his respect. Staff Sergeant, you assumed tactical command during an ambush. Alina's eyes flicked to him. Steady, calm. The base commander was killed in the opening minutes. Chain of command was compromised. As senior medic, I assumed responsibility for casualty evacuation. Standard protocol, sir. Her words were matter of fact, but Mitchell and everyone else knew there was nothing standard about it. Command and triage simultaneously under fire, that was survival forged by sheer will. Captain Morrison shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence drained from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then tried once more. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, this morning when I asked you to serve. You didn't ask about my background, sir, Alina said, her voice even professional. You asked if I could carry plates and pour water. The room seemed to recoil at her precision. Morrison's face flushed red. He looked down, suddenly aware of how small his authority seemed. Stone's gaze stayed locked on Alina. Her expression was sharp but not unkind. 3 deployments, a Silver Star, combat medic, and now serving coffee at Fort Meridian. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. That is not a story I'm willing to ignore. Blackwood's gravelly voice joined hers, calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Neither am I. He turned his eyes on Colonel Hartley, who sat 2 seats down, the color draining from his face. Colonel, explain to me how a decorated combat veteran is working food service logistics at your base. Hartley cleared his throat, caught between the hammer and the anvil. Sir, civilian personnel assignments are based on available positions and general qualifications. We don't always have visibility into military backgrounds. Stone's voice cut him off. General qualifications, that's the system you're relying on. You're telling me a Silver Star recipient fell through the cracks because you didn't bother to ask what she was qualified for. Hartley shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Alina as though hoping she would rescue him. She didn't. She sat still, calm, the storm swirling around her. Lieutenant Amanda Foster, eager to recover from her earlier dismissal, spoke up. Perhaps veterans sometimes prefer simpler work, something without the stress of combat, a structured, predictable role. Alina's eyes turned to her, steady but unyielding. Ma'am, veterans prefer meaningful work, work that recognizes their skills. Simplicity isn't the goal, purpose is. The correction landed like a slap. Foster looked away, chastened. Stone's expression softened just slightly. Staff Sergeant, why did you separate, if you don't mind me asking? Alina hesitated. The words tasted metallic, like blood on her tongue. Medical discharge, ma'am, service-connected disabilities. The officers around the table shifted, uncomfortable. Mitchell cleared his throat. If you're comfortable sharing, what conditions? Alina inhaled once, steadying herself. Traumatic brain injury, orthopedic injuries, post-traumatic stress. Her tone was clinical, detached, as if reciting a file rather than her own life. The silence that followed wasn't pity, it was respect. The kind of silence soldiers gave to someone who had carried more than most could endure. Blackwood nodded slowly. Common injuries for that theater, but never common stories. Morrison fumbled, desperate to recover ground. Staff Sergeant, if I'd known about your disabilities. Alina's eyes cut to him, sharp but calm. My disabilities don't affect my ability to perform assigned duties, Captain. The issue isn't whether I can carry trays. The issue is whether my actual skills are being used at all. The statement hung in the air, undeniable, unanswerable. Stone's jaw tightened. Exactly. How many others like her are being wasted in this system? How many trained leaders, specialists, combat veterans are stacking boxes and serving coffee because no one bothered to look deeper? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge, a demand. The room shifted again when Father Miguel Santos, the base chaplain, appeared in the doorway, surprised to find the luncheon still in progress. His kind eyes scanned the table, then found Alina. Forgive the interruption. I was looking for Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. She usually helps with our veteran support group on Tuesdays. Every officer turned to look at her again. Another piece of the puzzle sliding into place. General Stone's eyes softened, but her voice remained sharp. You volunteer with veteran support. Alina gave a small nod. I assist with logistics. Sometimes I speak to soldiers about navigating the VA transition issues. Father Santos stepped forward, his voice filled with quiet conviction. She's been invaluable. Dozens of veterans have found stability because of her. She has a gift, generals, not just experience, empathy. Morrison looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He had reduced her to a tray carrier. And here was the chaplain calling her indispensable. Rosa Martinez, drawn in by the prolonged silence, appeared hesitantly at the door. Alina, the staff's asking if we should begin cleanup. Her voice trailed off when she saw Alina seated at the officers' table, generals on either side. General Stone turned to Rosa. Join us, please. Confused but obedient, Rosa stepped forward. She sat, glancing nervously between Alina and the generals. Stone's question was direct. You work closely with Ms. Rodriguez. Have you noticed skills beyond what her position requires? Rosa blinked. Yes, ma'am. She handles logistics better than anyone. She understands operations in ways that surprise me. She catches implications before the rest of us even notice. I always assumed she had some deeper experience. Stone turned back to Alina. You weren't as invisible as you thought. Alina exhaled quietly, her mask thinning. For months she had hidden, blending in, vanishing into background noise. But the truth had seeped out anyway in how she carried herself, how she noticed details, how she anticipated problems. Blackwood placed his coffee cup down with deliberate care, the porcelain clicking against the saucer. The sound cut through the air. Colonel Hartley, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Tell me, do you consider this an efficient use of resources? Employing a Silver Star recipient with combat medical training as a food service coordinator. Hartley's throat worked. Sir, I'll need to review the personnel files, understand how this happened. Review the files, Blackwood repeated, his tone hardening. You should have known already. Hartley wilted beneath the weight of the rebuke. Alina sat quietly, letting the storm rage. She didn't need to add more. Her very presence was indictment enough. Captain Morrison's voice finally broke the silence, weak, unsteady. Staff Sergeant, if I'd known. Alina looked at him with calm precision. Captain, my background hasn't changed since this morning. The only thing that changed is your awareness of it. The words cut deeper than any blade. Morrison's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. Stone leaned forward again, her voice carrying the weight of finality. How many more Elena Rodriguez's are out there, overlooked, underutilized, wasted? This ends here. The room breathed as one, the weight of the truth pressing down on every uniform. Elena, once invisible, was now the mirror in which they saw their failure. And though she sat quietly, hands folded, her silence roared louder than any speech. The wait in the dining hall was almost unbearable, not because of the heat, though the late summer sun pressed relentlessly against the tall windows, not because of the food, though most plates now sat forgotten, salmon growing cold, pie untouched. The heaviness came from truth, laid bare like a wound that could no longer be ignored. Elena sat perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap. She had the stillness of someone who knew movement could shatter fragile ground. Every word she had spoken had pulled her further into the light, and with each one, the anonymity she had built for 18 months dissolved. General Stone's eyes hadn't left her. That piercing gaze was no longer curiosity. It was recognition, and anger, not at Elena, but at the system that had hidden her in plain sight. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Stone said, her voice level but carrying the weight of command. "What action earned you the Silver Star?" Elena had known the question would come. She had hoped it wouldn't, but denial was no longer possible. She took a steady breath, her mind slipping back to a place she had fought to keep buried. "Forward Operating Base, Helmand Province," she began. Her voice was calm, detached, like someone reading an after-action report rather than reliving it. "We came under coordinated attack. Mortars, small arms, multiple casualties. The medevac bird was disabled on the landing zone. I provided emergency trauma care to 12 wounded soldiers under fire. Then I organized and led their evacuation to a secondary extraction point." The words were plain, stripped of drama, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Every officer at that table knew what she wasn't saying, the screams, the blood, the chaos. They knew what it meant to drag bodies through fire, to hold lives in your hands with seconds to spare. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice filled with reverence. "You led an evacuation while treating the wounded. That's extraordinary." Elena's gaze didn't waver. The base commander was killed in the first strike. Protocol dictated someone assume control. I was the senior medic. Protocol, as if it were just procedure, but everyone knew it was more than that. Lieutenant Foster looked down, shame burning in her cheeks. Minutes earlier she had dismissed veterans as seekers of simplicity. Now she sat across from a woman who had carried lives on her shoulders while under fire. Morrison, pale and sweating, tried to salvage dignity. "Staff Sergeant, when I asked you to help today, Elena cut him off gently, her tone respectful but firm. "Captain, my background didn't change in the last 3 hours. Only your perception did." Her words landed like hammer blows. Morrison looked away, ashamed. Stone exhaled slowly, leaning back. Her voice was low but sharp. "This is exactly the problem. This institution claims to honor veterans, yet here sits a decorated combat medic reduced to pouring coffee, and not one of us saw her until today." General Blackwood added, his gravelly tone carrying quiet condemnation. "Colonel Hartley, explain this. How does Fort Meridian employ a Silver Star recipient in food services?" Hartley's face was red, his voice strained. "Sir, civilian assignments are made based on available roles and basic qualifications. We don't always account for prior service." "Basic qualifications," Stone repeated, her voice like a blade. "You mean paperwork, you mean boxes checked on a form, not skill, not sacrifice, not valor." Hartley's shoulders sagged. He had no defense. Elena remained silent. Her silence had become its own force. Every officer could feel it, an indictment more powerful than accusation. At that moment, Father Santos cleared his throat at the doorway. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice breaking the tension without softening it. "I was looking for Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. She usually stops by the chapel on Tuesdays to help prepare for veteran support groups. Heads turned again toward Alina. Another layer revealed. Stone's eyes sharpened. You volunteer with veteran support. Alina gave a small nod. I assist with logistics, share experiences when needed. Father Santos stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. She does more than assist. She has guided dozens of veterans through transition, helped them navigate the VA, helped them face the things they couldn't put into words. She is indispensable. The word cut through Morrison like a blade. Indispensable. He had treated her like disposable labor. Now the chaplain himself called her essential. Rosa, still seated nervously beside Alina, found her voice. Ma'am, Alina has always been more than this job. She handles operations like she's lived them. She notices things none of us catch. I thought it was instinct. Now I see it was experience. Stone nodded slowly, her anger deepening. So the truth was visible all along, but the system refused to look. Blackwood leaned forward, fixing Hartley with a stare that could have bent steel. Colonel, how many more of your civilian employees are veterans whose skills are being wasted like this? Hartley stammered. Sir, I'll need to conduct a review. You should have already known, Blackwood cut in, his voice sharp. Leadership isn't blind paperwork, it's knowing the people under your command. Clearly, you didn't. The rebuke landed heavy. Hartley lowered his eyes. Alina's pulse thrummed. She wanted to vanish, but there was no returning to invisibility now. The generals weren't speaking only about her anymore. They were speaking through her, using her as the mirror of every institutional failure. Captain Morrison tried again, desperation in his tone. If I had known. Alina turned her gaze on him, calm and precise. Captain, knowledge doesn't change who I am, only how you see me. That is the problem. Stone's expression hardened. Exactly. How many commanders, how many officers make assumptions every day? How many Rodriguezes are overlooked, silenced, wasted? The air grew thicker with every word. Then in the quiet, Alina spoke not loudly but with the kind of voice that carried because it was rooted in truth. Ma'am, most veterans don't want recognition. We don't want pity. We want to be seen for what we can do. That's all. Her words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to brush away. The ornate chandelier glittered above them, its light falling on mahogany wood, on untouched plates, on uniforms that now seemed smaller, less certain. For hours, the officers had spoken of numbers, budgets, readiness. Now all of it felt hollow. Because sitting among them was proof that their system had failed in the simplest, most human way, seeing the worth of one of their own. Stone finally leaned back, her voice cold, cutting. This ends here. No more invisibility, no more waste. Blackwood gave a small nod. His gravelly tone confirmed it. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is no longer unseen. Alina's heart pounded in her chest. The walls of anonymity she had built so carefully had collapsed. She had entered this room as a server. She would leave as something else entirely. And though she sat silently, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The room no longer felt like a luncheon. The plates were untouched, the chatter silenced. What lingered instead was the weight of a reckoning, an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing about this gathering would be remembered for the salmon or the pie. General Stone's eyes stayed locked on Alina. There was no condescension in her gaze, no pity. Only the fierce, unrelenting focus of a leader who had spent her career demanding the truth others avoided. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, she began, her tone deliberate. You said you were medically discharged. Explain. Alina sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady but stripped of any pretense. Yes, ma'am. Following my third deployment, I sustained a traumatic brain injury from blast exposure, orthopedic damage to my left leg, PTSD symptoms that impaired readiness. Her words were simple, clinical, but the silence that followed told the real story. The officers knew what she wasn't saying. The headaches that never left, the knee that gave out without warning, the nights punctured by screams only she could hear. Colonel Hartley cleared his throat nervously. And yet, here you are, fully functional, working, contributing. Why wasn't that considered? Alina turned her gaze toward him, even but sharp. Because the system measures disability by limitations, Colonel, not by potential. The truth struck like a bullet. Every officer around the table flinched inwardly. They knew she was right. Mitchell leaned forward, his brow furrowed. How did the discharge process treat you? Her jaw tightened. Like a file, not a person. Appointments, forms, evaluations, each one reducing me to percentages. She paused, the silence itself a condemnation. 30% for the leg, 40 for the TBI, 50 for PTSD. Numbers, that's all I became. Foster swallowed hard, her earlier arrogance nowhere to be found. And those numbers determined your future. Yes, ma'am, they determined compensation, eligibility, what doors closed and which stayed open. None of them considered what I could still give. Stone's voice cut through, quiet but firm. That's the heart of it, isn't it? We discard people when they don't fit the mold, and then we wonder why so many feel abandoned. Alina didn't nod. She didn't need to. The truth was already written across the officers' faces. Father Santos, still standing near the door, added softly, I've seen her sit across from men twice her size, men shattered by war, men who couldn't speak their pain. She gives them words. She gives them courage. No evaluation could capture that. Rosa, her hands clasped tightly, spoke too. She notices things others miss, not just in numbers or logistics, in people. She sees them when no one else does. The dining hall had become something different, not a room of hierarchy, but a tribunal of conscience. And Alina, though silent now, was its unintentional judge. Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably, sweat on his brow. Staff Sergeant, forgive me, but why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you tell us who you were? Alina's eyes turned to him, calm, sharp. Because, Captain, I shouldn't have to. The answer gutted him. Morrison sat back, stunned, his earlier arrogance now exposed for what it was, blindness. General Blackwood finally spoke, his gravelly voice resonant. Staff Sergeant, you carry yourself with discipline, precision, leadership. Why food services? Alina inhaled slowly. Because when I left the Army, I applied for dozens of jobs. Most saw a discharge code and moved on. Some saw combat medic and assumed my skills weren't transferable. This was the first offer that came. Her voice didn't break, but the quiet steel behind it cut deeper than any plea could have. Stone leaned forward, her fists tightening on the table. You applied for dozens of jobs, and this was the only one. Yes, ma'am. The silence thickened. Each officer felt the indictment settle heavier on their shoulders. Mitchell spoke softly as though ashamed. What does that say about us? About the system? That a Silver Star recipient was left to, he stopped himself, but the word hung anyway, to serve. Alina didn't rescue them from their discomfort. She sat quietly, letting the truth breathe. Foster finally whispered, how many more veterans are like you? Alina's eyes flicked toward her. More than you think. Men and women with training, leadership, resilience. But when the uniform comes off, the world sees only broken pieces, not potential. The room seemed to shrink around those words. Stone sat back, her eyes blazing. This is not just your story. This is our failure, our collective blindness. Blackwood nodded slowly, each movement deliberate. And failures can be corrected, if we have the will. Colonel Hartley's voice cracked as he tried to salvage ground. General, perhaps we could review veteran hearing protocols, adjust the process. Adjust, Stone's voice sliced through him. No, overhaul, burn it down and rebuild it. How many lives have we wasted already? The force of her words left no room for argument. Alina sat still, the storm raging around her. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. She hadn't wanted this confrontation. But as she looked at Stone, at Blackwood, at the officers who could no longer meet her eyes, she realized something. Her silence had protected her, but it had also protected the system. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let that silence break. Her voice, quiet but unwavering, carried across the table. Generals, officers, I'm not here for recognition. I don't need ceremonies or speeches. What I need, what every veteran needs, is to be seen. Not for the medal, not for the wounds, for the skills, for the worth that remains. The words landed with the weight of scripture. Father Santos bowed his head, murmuring a prayer of thanks. Rosa wiped at her eyes quietly. Mitchell sat frozen, ashamed at how long it had taken for him to see what was right in front of him. And Stone, fierce and unrelenting, leaned forward one last time. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, hear me clearly. You will not be invisible again. Not here, not anywhere." Blackwood's gravelly voice sealed it. "This is no longer just a lunch. This is the start of a reckoning." Alina exhaled, the breath shaky but steadying. She hadn't asked for this moment, but it had come anyway, and now there was no turning back. The afternoon light had shifted by now, stretching long shadows across the polished floor. What had begun as a luncheon had turned into something closer to confession, tribunal, and reckoning all at once. None of the generals had touched their coffee in nearly an hour. General Blackwood broke the silence, his gravelly voice deliberate. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I need to ask something. Not for the record, not for the medal, for us." Alina's posture remained straight, but her pulse quickened. She knew what was coming. "What happened that day," Blackwood said softly, "when you earned the Silver Star? Don't give us the file version. Tell us what it cost." The air seemed to tighten. Rosa glanced at her, worry in her eyes. Father Santos bowed his head as though bracing for pain that wasn't his to bear. Alina's lips pressed together. For 18 months she had buried that day behind walls of silence. But she saw the faces around her now, officers who had spoken of numbers and strategy suddenly stripped of certainty, waiting to understand the ground their soldiers had bled on. Her voice came quiet, steady, stripped of embellishment. "We were on the outskirts of Sangin, a coordinated assault, mortars first. Shrapnel tore through the barracks before most men even grabbed their rifles. The first thing I heard was screaming." The words pulled the officers inward, their imaginations filling in the rest. "I grabbed my kit and ran. The first man I reached had lost his leg, arterial bleed. I clamped it, dragged him behind cover. Mortars kept landing, dust, fire, the ground shook, but every cry I heard I moved toward." Her eyes stayed fixed, her tone clinical, but her hands clenched in her lap. 12 soldiers in all, one after another. Burns, penetrating trauma. Shrapnel embedded so deep I had to cut on the ground with nothing but a flashlight. I kept working, even when rounds snapped overhead. I kept working until I couldn't feel my arms. The room was deathly still. When the medevac bird went down on the LZ, command fractured. No one gave orders, so I did. We carried the wounded to a fallback zone. I coordinated a perimeter. I radioed secondary extraction. We held until reinforcements arrived. She stopped. Her voice didn't crack, but her silence carried the screams none of them could hear. Mitchell's throat worked, but no sound came. Foster had tears in her eyes. She tried to blink away. Morrison sat rigid, his shame growing heavier by the minute. General Stone's voice was low, almost reverent. "And how many made it out because of you?" Alina inhaled, her chest tight. 10, 2 didn't make it. 2, the word itself was a wound. They died with me holding their hands. Silence again. Not the silence of disinterest, the silence of respect, of grief, of weight none of them could measure. Father Santos's voice broke softly into the stillness. "And you carried them with you, every day since?" Alina nodded once, unable to deny it. Rosa's hand hovered near hers. not quite touching but offering quiet solidarity. General Blackwood exhaled, the sound rough. Staff Sergeant, I've seen men command battalions with less composure than you just described. And yet when you came home, the system decided you were unfit. Alina's answer came sharp, stripped of bitterness but edged with steel. It decided I was injured, and it forgot I was capable. Stone leaned forward, her fists pressed against the table. That is not just a mistake, that is betrayal. Her words landed heavy, and no one dared to contradict them. Mitchell finally found his voice, strained and uncertain. Staff Sergeant, how have you carried this, all of it? Alina's eyes flicked toward Father Santos. With help, with silence, with prayer, and with work even if it wasn't the work I trained for. The chaplain nodded slowly, his eyes damp. She turns her pain into purpose. That's why the men and women come to her. They don't see a server, they see someone who understands. Rosa added quietly, she sees them even when no one else does. That's why we trust her. Stone's jaw tightened, her gaze sweeping the table. Do you hear this? We talk about retention, about readiness, about manpower. And yet, one of the finest NCOs I've ever heard speak was discarded into obscurity. This is what happens when systems value paperwork over people. Blackwood's gravelly tone added the final nail, and it stops here. The officers shifted uncomfortably. For them, this wasn't just a revelation about Alina, it was a mirror. How many others had they overlooked? How many more lives had slipped into silence because no one asked, no one saw? Captain Morrison's voice cracked as he tried once more. Staff Sergeant, I don't know how to apologize. Alina's gaze cut to him, not cruel but unflinching. Don't apologize to me, Captain. Change the way you see the next soldier. That's the only apology that matters. Her words seared through the room like fire. Stone looked at Blackwood, her voice sharp, decisive. We cannot let this end as a single revelation. We need action, a review of every veteran employed under Army contracts, cross-check skills, place them where they can lead, not where they're wasted. Blackwood gave a slow nod. Agreed, and not just review, accountability. Every commander responsible for knowing the people under his roof, uniformed or not. Hartley swallowed hard, knowing the storm was now aimed squarely at him. Alina spoke then, her voice softer but carrying the weight of truth. Generals, policies are important, but culture is stronger. If the culture sees veterans as broken, no directive will fix it. The words cut deeper than any reform plan. Stone nodded slowly, her eyes fierce. Then culture must change, and it begins here. Alina exhaled, steady but weary. For months she had lived invisible. In a single afternoon, the walls of silence had collapsed. She had carried stories no one asked for. Now they had heard them, and there was no undoing it. But as she sat there, surrounded by officers who could no longer look away, she felt something shift, not relief, not pride. Something quieter, something dangerous. Hoping. The dining hall no longer resembled a luncheon. The silverware lay untouched, the food congealed on plates, the air heavy with the scent of coffee gone cold. What remained was not ceremony but reckoning, a room of officers staring at the embodiment of a truth they had long ignored. General Stone leaned forward, her hands folded on the polished wood, her expression sharp and unyielding. This is not going to fade into polite silence. Not today. Not after what we've heard. We will not let this be another forgotten story. General Blackwood nodded, his gravelly tone filling the room. Reforms start here, at this table. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you've lived what the rest of us have only read in reports. We need your voice. Alina stiffened, the weight of the words pressing against her chest. For months she had blended into the background, her identity buried beneath trays and schedules. Now the generals themselves were pulling her into the center. She chose her words carefully, her voice low but steady. Generals, I'm not a policymaker. I'm just one veteran. Stone's gaze sharpened. Exactly. And that's why your voice matters. You're not a statistic. You're not a box checked on a form. You're the reality our policies keep missing. The officers around the table shifted uncomfortably. Some scribbled notes, others avoided her eyes, each wrestling with the knowledge that they had been blind until forced to see. Colonel Hartley finally spoke, his voice stiff. Perhaps we could initiate a review of all civilian hires with prior service, cross-reference qualifications, adjust placement. Stone cut him off, her tone like steel. Not review, overhaul, you've heard her. We can't measure people by paperwork alone. Every commander must know the stories of those under their roofs, uniform or not. Blackwood added, and accountability must follow. A missed skill is not just inefficiency, it's negligence. Morrison flinched visibly at the word, shame crawling across his features. Alina glanced between them, her silence deliberate. She hadn't come here to ignite reforms. She had come to serve lunch. Yet here they were, ready to rewrite systems around her. The irony wasn't lost on her. Father Santos's voice cut gently into the tension. Change is not only about systems, generals, it's about dignity. You can rewrite policies, but unless dignity is restored, men and women will still fall through cracks. Stone turned to Alina. Do you agree? Alina hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, dignity is everything. Veterans don't need handouts. They don't need pity. They need purpose. If you give them roles where they can contribute, they'll exceed expectations. But if you strip them of identity, they'll fade. The truth lingered like smoke in the air. Rosa found her courage, her voice quiet but certain. Alina doesn't just do logistics here. She mentors. She notices when people are struggling. She's already doing the work this system overlooks. Stone's eyes flicked back to Alina. So the culture shift starts with you, with what you've already been doing in silence. We amplify it. The idea made Alina's chest tighten. She hadn't asked for amplification. She hadn't wanted visibility. And yet, looking at Rosa's earnest face, at Father Santos's steady faith, she realized they already saw her differently. She wasn't invisible anymore. Mitchell cleared his throat, his voice more respectful than before. Staff Sergeant, if you were advising us, what would you change first? The question hung heavy. Alina's instinct was to deflect, but something inside urged her to answer. First, she said, her voice calm but unyielding, stop treating discharge codes as death sentences. A medical discharge doesn't erase skills. Second, pair veterans with mentors who understand transition, not caseworkers reading files. And third, listen. Not with checklists, with attention. Sometimes all it takes to prevent a spiral is someone seeing you. Her words were plain, not polished, but they landed harder than any briefing slide could have. Foster whispered almost to herself, "We've been blind." Stone looked around the table, her eyes fierce. "Then open your eyes. Today is the line, before and after. From this day forward, no one like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez will sit unseen in the back of our halls." Blackwood leaned back, his gravelly voice carrying finality. "This is more than policy. This is leadership, and leadership is measured by whether we see our people." The officers sat frozen, caught between shame and resolve. Alina lowered her gaze briefly, her heart thundering. She hadn't asked for this role, hadn't wanted the spotlight. Yet as she looked at Stone, at Blackwood, at the younger officers shifting uneasily, she saw something shifting. For the first time, they weren't talking about her. They were listening to her. And that was a dangerous kind of power. Rosa touched her arm gently, whispering, "They need you." Father Santos gave a small nod of agreement. "Perhaps you were brought here for this very moment." Alina swallowed hard. She didn't believe in destiny, but she did believe in responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, her silence had carried far enough. Her voice came soft but steady, cutting through the thick air. "Then don't let this end as a speech. Turn it into action. Not tomorrow, not next quarter. Now, before another veteran disappears into invisibility." The words struck like thunder. Stone's eyes gleamed with fire. "You have my word, Staff Sergeant. This ends now." Blackwood gave a single nod, slow and deliberate. "And once begun, it will not stop." Alina sat back, the weight pressing against her but also lifting in strange ways. The anonymity she had fought so hard to keep was gone. In its place was something she hadn't expected to feel again. Not pride, not relief. Duty. The clock in the corner ticked softly, though no one at the table seemed aware of time anymore. What had been planned as a 90-minute luncheon had stretched into an afternoon of revelations. The plates were cold, the coffee bitter, yet no one dared to move. It was General Stone who finally broke the stillness, her voice low but ringing with authority. "We end here today, but this conversation will not be left in this room, not while I hold rank." Her words carried the certainty of command, not suggestion, not proposal, a vow. General Blackwood leaned forward, his gravelly voice slow and deliberate. "Agreed. What we've seen here is failure, but failure unacknowledged becomes corruption. We will not leave it unacknowledged." The officers shifted, some with shame, others with resolve. Captain Morrison stared at the table, his earlier arrogance burned away. Foster clenched her jaw, her earlier doubts now replaced by a determination to see differently. Mitchell sat upright, as if bracing himself to ensure this moment would change more than rhetoric. Alina sat quietly among them, her presence now undeniable. For so long she had been invisible, a face behind trays, a name on no roster, a veteran reduced to function. But now every eye saw her, not as a server, not even as a medal, as a person who had endured, who had led, who had carried. Father Santos folded his hands, his tone calm but resolute. "The measure of this day will not be what was spoken here, but what is carried outward, into policy, into culture, into hearts." Stone nodded once sharply. "Then we carry it, each of us, no excuses." Her gaze fell on Colonel Hartley, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight. She didn't have to speak further. The message was clear. Leadership meant responsibility, not paperwork. Rosa, still at Alina's side, finally whispered, "You've changed everything today." Alina shook her head softly. "No, I just spoke what was already true. They chose to listen." But Rosa's eyes told her she didn't believe that. And deep down, Alina wasn't sure she believed it either. The generals rose slowly, the scrape of chairs against wood echoing like ceremony. Blackwood extended his hand first, rough and firm. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you have reminded us what courage looks like, not in combat but in truth." Alina hesitated only a heartbeat before shaking it, her grip steady. Stone followed, her clasp strong, her eyes fierce. "And you have reminded us of our duty. You have my word, your story will not be silenced again." Each officer rose in turn, some extending hands, others bowing heads in quiet respect. For Alina, it was overwhelming, not because she craved recognition, but because she had never sought it. Yet here it was, thrust upon her like a weight she had no choice but to carry. When the generals finally departed, their aides trailing behind them with hurried notes and tense expressions, the room fell into a softer silence. Rosa leaned close, her voice trembling. "Do you realize what just happened? They're going to change things because of you." Alina looked down at her folded hands, or because they couldn't ignore it anymore. Father Santos smiled faintly. "Sometimes that is the same thing." For the first time that day, Alina allowed herself to exhale fully. The tension that had gripped her chest loosened, though it didn't vanish. She knew too well that promises made in rooms like this could fade in the corridors of power, but she also knew she had left them no excuse. Not anymore. She rose, her knees stiff from hours of sitting, her limp more pronounced in the quiet. Rosa reached to steady her, but Alina waved her off gently. She had walked through fire. She would walk out of this hall on her own. As they stepped into the corridor, sunlight slanted through tall windows, painting the floor in gold. Soldiers passed, Clerks hurried, the daily rhythm of the base resuming as if nothing monumental had occurred inside. To them, Alina was still just a civilian worker, and for a fleeting moment she felt the comfort of that anonymity again. But Rosa's words echoed, "You've changed everything." And in her chest, Alina knew the truth. Invisibility was no longer an option. Days later, whispers spread across Fort Meridian. A luncheon that had shifted into something else entirely. Generals leaving with faces drawn tight, aides scrambling to draft memoranda, and the name Rodriguez spoken with reverence in corners where once it had been unknown. Reforms began moving faster than anyone expected. Commanders were tasked with personally reviewing the veterans under their roofs. Job placements were revisited, mentorship programs drafted. A cultural shift had been forced into motion, not by policy papers, but by one woman who had sat quietly and told the truth. Alina did not attend the meetings. She did not sign the memoranda. She returned to her role in food services, steady and unassuming. But everywhere she went, eyes lingered longer. Respect replaced dismissal. Even Morrison, once so blind, now nodded in quiet deference when their paths crossed. It was uncomfortable, but it was also irreversible. One evening she sat in the chapel as the sun set, the light painting the stained glass in hues of fire. Father Santos knelt beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. Alina thought for a long moment before answering. "Exposed, but lighter." He nodded as if he had expected that. Exposed truth can be a burden, but it can also be liberation. Her gaze fixed on the flickering candles. "I didn't want this. I only wanted to serve quietly." "And you still do," he replied gently. "But sometimes service is louder than we plan." Weeks passed. Reforms took shape. Some resisted, some embraced. But the shift could not be undone. The memory of that luncheon lingered in the halls of power, retold in whispers and reports. And Alina, she remained who she had always been, steady, disciplined, unwilling to center herself. Yet wherever she went now, she carried a truth that could not be unseen. One afternoon, Rosa approached her in the kitchen, eyes bright. "They're starting a veteran mentorship program. They asked if you'd lead it." Alina froze, her heart pounding. Leadership, visibility, responsibility, the very things she had tried to leave behind. But she saw Rosa's hopeful face. She remembered the general's vows. She thought of the two soldiers whose hands she had held in Helmand, the ones who had not made it home. And she realized some silences were no longer hers to keep. She nodded once firmly, "I'll do it." Rosa smiled through tears. Months later, in a quiet ceremony unannounced to the press, General Stone returned to Fort Meridian. No stage, no cameras, only a gathering of veterans, soldiers, and staff. She pinned a small insignia on Alina's lapel, not a new medal, but the emblem of the mentorship program she would now lead. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Stone said, her voice firm, "this is not recognition. This is responsibility. You are the beginning of change." Alina met her eyes steady, resolved. "Then let's begin." And in that moment, surrounded by those who once overlooked her, Alina Rodriguez stood not as a server, not as a statistic, but as what she had always been. A leader forged in silence, now finally seen. In the end, it wasn't the medal that defined her. It wasn't the luncheon or the general's vows. It was the quiet truth she had carried, the resilience no system could measure, the dignity no discharge could erase. And though she returned to her quiet work, her story lingered like a fire carried forward, a reminder to all who heard it that strength often hides in silence, and that the unseen deserve to be seen.